Despite James I's belief in the absolute power of rulers, England had property rights and rule of law, plus a start to democracy with a pesky parliament limiting royal revenues. The New World offered gold and glory, with almost no cost using joint stock companies. The first two of interest were the London Company, funded mainly by Londoners, later to be called the Virginia Company, and the Plymouth Company, funded by people of the port city of Plymouth, England. Both were under royal charters, with the king to receive a cut of all gold and silver. The idea of colonizing an unknown land thousands of miles away seems to demonstrate wishful thinking or brilliant propaganda by the sponsors. England was the home of budding Western civilization. Who would be attracted when the chance of survival was less than 50-50 and everything had to be built? These were not starving people or subsistence farmers. The largest group was gentlemen, suggesting they had no useful skills, just complaining mouths demanding food. The London Company sent 3 ships to Virginia under Captain Newport, despite the missing Roanoke Islanders. Of the 120 colonists, 104 survived the trip into Chesapeake Bay and disembarked on a peninsula on the James River in 1607. Captain Newport left for more supplies and colonists. This was an area not inhabited by native tribes because it was a swampy location. The water was brackish and the land inferior. The brackish water was a primary source of disease. After that, it was famine, malaria, other diseases, and Indian attacks. This was still their land. When the ship with supplies returned in 1608, there were only 40 survivors. The earliest English colonists were about as ill-prepared as migrating settlers could get. They seemed to have poor plans for how to feed themselves or much of a clue how to gather, hunt, fish, or grow anything. Without farmers or farm equipment, prospects were bad, although they were surrounded by food abundance. The fate for most was a relatively quick death, assuming death by disease or starvation is quick. Granted, a couple of arrows would do the trick. The British had a century of contact with the New World. Why 17th century colonists would be so ill-prepared is a mystery. The colonists were not idle when they landed. There were several carpenters, laborers, and a blacksmith among the colonists. They built a triangular fort and other buildings, fearing both the Indians and Spanish. When relations with the Powhatans were unfriendly, it was dangerous to go outside the fort looking for food. John Smith, one of the original council members, became a leader of the colony and proved resourceful. Smith insisted everyone work or not eat, showing them how to farm. He ordered men to fish and gather shellfish. Smith was particularly known for his deal with Chief Powhatan, Wansakoff of the Powhatan Confederacy, and for Pocahontas saving his life. Note that Smith was a great storyteller, not necessarily an accurate one. Smith explored Chesapeake Bay and later mapped New England. The food story of Jamestown was initially avoiding starvation after the supplies ran out. When on friendly terms, the Powhatans supplied food. Hunting, fishing, and gathering were attempted with limited tools. By 1608, about 40 acres of land were cleared and corn grown with limited success. Making people, that is, gentlemen, farmers, required force. The starving time was the winter of 1609 and 10, when their fort was under siege and drought had been a problem. They did eat the horses, rats, snakes, and there were charges of cannibalism. The supply ships were damaged in a hurricane, but some ships arrived later with more supplies and colonists. Tobacco was the most successful plant in the sense that it was exported profitably. The purpose of the colony was making money. John Rolfe, a smoker, was given credit for bringing Spanish tobacco seeds to Jamestown in 1610, although Virginia Indians also grew and used tobacco. Exporting tobacco started in 1612. Tobacco leaves were bartered and essentially used as money. Over time, tobacco was inspected and warehouses built. Large planters shipped their tobacco to England using agents to sell their product and ship English goods back. Small planters used local agents. Tobacco spread across much of Virginia and later across the South, grown with slave labor. Part of the problem was tobacco exhausts the soil. Wheat and other grains were also grown, along with corn, plus indigenous crops. Two events happened in 1619 at the opposite end of the justice scale. On the plus side was a small step for democracy. The Virginia Company created the Great Charter. Governing the colony would include a General Assembly, which first met in July 1619. The governor, councilors, and 22 elected burgesses. George Washington would later become a member of the House of Burgesses. On the injustice side was the arrival of the first slaves, 20 Africans. Poor white colonists arrived as indentured servants, granted freedom after some years of service. The black arrivals could have been given a similar status, but almost certainly worked in the tobacco fields. Slavery was institutionalized by 1640 as lifetime servitude. All of the early colonists were men, who occasionally married Powhatans, like John Rolfe marrying Pocahontas. Some of the later colonists brought their families. The London Company was looking for women young and uncorrupt who wanted to marry some guy on another continent, a marital immigration program. In addition to free passage, they got clothes, possibly land and furnishings. The guy she picked would pay for her passage. Some 90 arrived in 1620, then 57 more in 1622. Later colonists who paid their own way were given up to 50 acres of land near Jamestown. Without payment, they could come as indentured servants, including felons, orphans, and other undesirables. Large land grants were given to select capitalists. The population around Jamestown by 1635 was perhaps 5,000. The State House burned down in 1698, replaced by Williamsburg. Jamestown is now a historical site under the National Park Service. Even more legendary than Jamestown was the Plymouth colony, with later stories promoting American exceptionalism. Next time on Food History and Mystery.